afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul live lecture. In fact, today's discussion we are going to devote on a topic which is very important from the point of view of political theory and political philosophy, that is conceptions of freedom in political theory. In fact, why we are talking in terms of this plural conceptions, because there is no one concept of freedom in political theory. There are different perspectives, there are different point of views, there are different opinions, and therefore we have seen that freedom is the most contested and debated concept in political theory, and not from recent times, but from time immemorial, since ancient time we can say. In fact, it is a multifaceted concept, and it has certain cognate concepts as well, like rights, equality and justice. In fact, when we talk of freedom, normally it is implied that it stands for absence of impediments or obstruction to our thinking, expression, choice, movement and our dignity. But in fact, this absence of impediments or restraint is also one important entry point, vantage point, or one can say perspective. So far as the conception of freedom is concerned, there are other as well, and we will be coming to that. Now, generally freedom, if we discuss in terms of history of ideas, particularly in modern times, we will find that generally freedom has been seen through the prism of three connotations: A, absence of constraints; B, notion of choice; C, existence of conditions to actualize or realize the choice. So therefore, these are the three different ways in which scholars have thinkers have looked at it, particularly broadly within the liberal tradition. Of course, the third one, that is the conditions. In fact, one can say that liberal scholars on the whole have not been quite concerned with this condition aspect. In fact, that takes the discussion to another terrain, particularly the socialists, the idealists, and within liberal tradition, of course, one can say that some of them who have been talking about social conditions are not considered central to liberal discourse or liberal thinking. So therefore, there are three different points of view, or three perspectives, or one can say connotations associated with the idea of freedom in modern time. In fact, if we run our eyes on the history of ideas, particularly in modern times, we will find thinkers and theories divided on these connotations, and that has led to major debate, contestation and division among scholars. In fact, within a tradition, and of course in terms of inter-tradition discourse. Now, before we move further in our discussion about this entire idea or various conceptions of freedom, on what scale we can have discussion of these various conceptions, let's have a brief discussion on this distinction which is sometimes made between freedom and liberty, and both are interestingly used interchangeably in political theory. In fact, to great extent one can say that they are used synonymously. Both are in fact also synonymous in popular usages, but some scholars follow the distinction and take the pain to make clear that in what way freedom is different from liberty. In fact, I should mention Maurice Cranston, who believes that liberty used in legal and political senses and context, whereas freedom is to be understood in philosophical and more general context. In fact, another scholar, Hannah Pitkin, who is basically a very celebrated author on democratic representation and other things, she has pointed out, or rather she is of this view, that liberty is more plural in the sense that it can be used in more than one senses, and freedom is more holistic in the sense that understanding of it cannot be personal, rather it is more holistic, covering whole gamuts of human experiences in society. So therefore, you can see how Pitkin has looked at it. In fact, she believes that the liberty is used mostly as a more limited sense, whereas freedom is more expansive. Something what normally in Indian context one can say the Swaraj, the way this Swaraj discourse has materialized in India, which has been considered more holistic, which is based on the larger human experiences, and therefore it is more civilizational, emancipatory and liberative. Now, of course, before we take these different ways in which these connotations can be understood, both ideologically and in terms of other parameters, let us have a look at the xenology of this concept of freedom. Now, of course, we can see that this concept of freedom has been there since time immemorial, since perhaps human existence, because every species wants to be free, be it human or non-human. In fact, of course, the human society has witnessed its evolution gradually, and today the shape in which we find the entire idea or concept of freedom is a culmination of this long process. In fact, the ancient time, the ancient period, in fact, the Greek political thinkers who reflected on number of issues of pertaining to human existence and human society, in fact, they also engaged with this question of freedom. Of course, their take on freedom was different. In fact, as we know that particularly the two important thinkers of this period, Plato and Aristotle, they reflected on number of issues, how the human beings can lead a good life, and how that society can be made more livable. But one thing is very clear, that the reference point of these Greek thinkers was the city-state of ancient Greece, and particularly the community life people were living in the city-state. So, therefore, they looked at freedom differently from what we understand today. In fact, they looked at freedom from the point of view of the community life, and also from the point of view of obedience to the larger community life and the state, because this is how perhaps they looked at human freedom. In fact, for them, meeting of assemblies of the polis and the debates going on and the public discussions which used to take place in those assemblies, in fact, implied freedom and human participation, human beings' participation in those meetings, those deliberations essentially implied freedom for them. So, therefore, in fact, politics was an important theme for these thinkers, particularly Aristotle, who also authored a book called Politics, and therefore participation in political life was perhaps something which actualized or realized, helped human beings actualize or realize their life. So, therefore, freedom was understood through such framework. Now, of course, liberty as therefore in that context, and here I would like to mention that particularly Aristotle was more concerned with the legal constitutional connotation of freedom, which, as you have seen, that many scholars point out that is liberty, not freedom. So, therefore, liberty for them in general, and Aristotle in particular, was the discharge of citizenship role, and therefore one can say that participation in the political life, or one can say in the civic life, implied freedom for them. In medieval period, of course, the things were different. In fact, we remember medieval period as a dark age, largely because of the prevailing circumstances and situation in society. It was in West particularly, in Europe, it was basically the time of church state, supremacy of religion. In fact, reason didn't have much space. Human existence, or one can say human beings as autonomous agent as they have been looked at in modern time, was totally absent. So, therefore, in fact, we don't find much discussion of freedom in medieval period. The real turning point, in fact, so far as this entire discourse of freedom is concerned, is basically the modern time, and therefore the modern period is marked by number of important developments like Reformation, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and therefore modern period has been marked by this quest for freedom and liberation among human beings. And therefore, in modern times, we should remember that modern period has also been seen as the age of revolutions. Of course, the bourgeois revolutions have been the significant feature of modern era. In fact, French Revolution, American War of Independence, but before that, Britain, Civil War in England, Britain, and then you have number of other churnings and developments, and all of them contributing towards rise and flowering of modern ideas, including this idea of freedom, and that how human beings want to become free from all shackles of slavery, from all domination, from all control mechanism or control system in society, which basically pertain to their subjugation. So therefore, we can see that modern period is really a turning point so far as this genealogy of this concept of freedom is concerned. In fact, in modern time, this idea of freedom has been seen as pursuit of the struggle of human spirit to liberate itself from the private interest, or sometimes the pursuit of such private interest has been against the exercise of public authority of the state as well. So therefore, this has been the most important feature of these revolutions, these social churnings, that how human spirit can be liberated from both the private interest as well as from the exercise of public authority, or one can say that state as a public authority. So therefore, this has been the important dimension of autonomy of individual, or one can say that one can say the liberation of human beings from the shackles of subjugation. Now, it is in this context we can say that multiple conceptions of freedom have emerged or materialized in modern times. Because in modern time, number one, the freedom has been the most significant quest of human society. Number two, there has not been one way in which freedom has been realized or understood. There have been different ways to look at freedom, that what is freedom for human beings. And here we can see that on number of ways, on number of scales, this can be measured and can be discussed and understood. In fact, the thinkers and scholars have been divided among themselves, and the differences have been mostly along two major lines. The first one can say is the ideological line, or in terms of ideology, we can see that the thinkers and scholars have been divided among themselves about this idea of freedom. And if we look at this through the prism of ideology, then we find that we have we can see number of ideological schools emerging, and one can identify some of them. For example, republicanism associated with Machiavelli, Rousseau and Hannah Arendt in our times, then the liberal school or the liberal conception of freedom, then you have the Marxist conception of freedom, then the anarchist conception of freedom, and you of course you also have the idealist conception of freedom. In fact, I will dwell more extensively on the liberal and the republican and also the Marxist, but at the same time the anarchist and idealists are also equally important. In fact, one can say that anarchists sometimes exist between the liberal and the socialist. So therefore, they strike a different note. And idealist on the one hand, on the other hand, you can see that how they basically sublimate freedom into the state, and how they, for example, how Hegel's famous statement, the state is march of God on the earth, and human freedom is best actualized and realized in the state. So therefore, that is perhaps the representative statement coming from the idealist school. But there have been many idealists, and there are different types of idealists. But nonetheless, the important understanding of idealist take on freedom, that they look at society in an organic model, that the way you have a body, human body with different parts, and the body is more important than parts, and the parts can be understood only in terms of the larger existence of body. So therefore, the individuals and community, individuals and society, and individuals and the state, the collectivity, that means unit and the collective, individual and the collective. So the relationship they basically define, and then they look at freedom in terms of this collective identity of the individual, and mostly this collective identity is seen in terms of the identity of the state, the modern state. So therefore, that is the idealist. But anyway, and then there are also other variants of this ideology. But the second scale, before I tell you a little more on these ideological differences on the concept of freedom, let me also mention here that there is another scale on which also this entire idea of freedom is understood and defined. and that is basically in terms of negative and positive understanding of freedom. That what is the negative understanding of freedom, what is positive understanding of freedom, and then if you look at the whole host of thinkers and political theorists, they get divided on this negative positive scale. In fact, sometimes within liberals we can see that some of them are purely negative, but some of them try to slightly harmonize with the positive concept. But more or less the liberal school is more or less tilted in favor of this negative concept of freedom. Whereas on the positive side, you can see the socialists, the Marxists, one can say the idealists. So therefore, that way one can say that the positive, positive approach to freedom or positive view of freedom, does not exclude liberals as a whole, but mostly they pertain to the idealists, the Marxists, the socialists, and thinkers of other hues. Republicanism or Republican thinkers, but not the liberals, because quintessentially the liberals have been the proponent of the negative view of freedom, and that started a long time back with the classical liberalism, which is associated with this idea of laissez-faireism, and in fact Bentham and Locke are perhaps the high priest of that classical liberalism and that point of view. Of course, in recent years we have seen that revival of that classical perspective or classical point of view in form of neoliberalism, of course with some differences, and I will basically mention that what are the differences between classical liberals and the neoliberals briefly. So therefore, this is how we can see that this entire conceptions, when we talk in terms of plural, the conceptions of freedom, and as you have seen that there is not one but many, then these conceptions have been mostly based on these two different scales. One is ideology, another is this negative positive connotation of freedom. Now what we can also see that among this this ideological variants on this freedom, in fact the first one is the republicanism, and republicanism you should also remember that is essentially premised on the principle of equality, brotherhood, fraternity. One can say that absence of domination and subordination, and this republican tradition to some extent is traced back to the ancient Greek period. In fact, even in India, we can see that India had many republics, particularly in terms of this village republics, particularly the way they were functioning. But this entire Western political thought, so far republicanism is concerned, is at times traced back to the ancient Greek period, and there were many republican thinkers, or one can say that many traces of republicanism at that time. Of course, so far as Plato and Aristotle are concerned, as you have seen that they didn't think much of equality. In fact, they rather justified inequality from the different vantage points. Aristotle's famous statement that thinking and sweating cannot go together. So therefore, for example, they excluded many people, many types of citizens, or one can say not citizens, because they made a distinction between citizen and subject. So therefore, they excluded many people from the purview of the city-state or the citizenship rights, particularly women, alien, slaves, and so on and so forth. So therefore, the equality was not central to their discourse. But then there were sophists, there were Stoics and other in a Greco-Roman tradition, who one can say that basically gave enough indications about these republican ideas. Now in modern time, in fact what we find that the most important contribution so far as freedom from the republican perspective is concerned was made by Machiavelli, the Italian thinker, who is credited for giving his ideas in context of Renaissance. In fact, at times it is asked or it is said that Machiavelli was child of Renaissance. So therefore, Renaissance heralded a new era in Europe and European thinking, breaking from all shackles of authority and domination. So therefore, Machiavelli showed the seeds of this republican thinking in modern time. In fact, he is the first thinker in modern time to say that citizens must have obligations, and obligations to fellow citizens. So, two types of obligations. First, political obligations towards rulers, towards the state, and among obligations among fellow citizens. So, therefore, this entire concept of fraternity and brotherhood comes out of this statement of Machiavelli. So, therefore, today what we find that whenever Republican idea or the Republican thought is discussed, Machiavelli is often referred to as someone who basically recognized it, made mention of it, and has also contributed through his writings. The second important thinker, so far as this Republican tradition on freedom is concerned, is Rousseau, the French philosopher, political thinker Rousseau. And Rousseau is a very important thinker so far as freedom is concerned from number of point of view. And now interestingly, Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, three names are associated with this entire tradition called contract theory. Basically a theory which base the existence of a state on the consent of the people. But one thing is to be remembered, that all these three thinkers strike a different note. In fact, Hobbes and Locke to some extent enter this whole pantheon of liberal thought and thinking or thinkers, whereas Rousseau in fact breaks company. And the way Rousseau talked about contract, the way Rousseau talked about political obligation, the way Rousseau talked about general will, and the kind of sovereignty lying with general will. In fact, that is the community will, a will which is basically a will of all, in the interest of all, and therefore he made a distinction between actual will and real will, and general will he believed is based on real will, where human beings basically are not guided by their personal interest, or rather they are rise above their personal interest and think about community interest and community welfare. So, therefore, that concept of general will is so special in Rousseau's thought, and therefore, the freedom, the way Rousseau looked at freedom is equally interesting, because for Rousseau freedom is nothing but obedience to law which we prescribe to ourselves is freedom, and therefore, because for Rousseau the society should be under the rule of a general will, that is the will of all, and therefore, even if you are externalizing your sovereignty, you are not surrendering your sovereignty to any external force, but to yourself. So, therefore, in a very intricate and complex manner, basically Rousseau comes up with this argument of general will, political obligation, of freedom, and thereby laying the foundation to some extent for a direct democracy as well. So, therefore, in fact, Rousseau has been the most important champion of this Republican view of freedom in modern time. Now, Rousseau, of course, who is also considered along with Voltaire to be the ideologues of French Revolution. In fact, after that, of course, many revolutions and many revolutionary ideas have been influenced by their thinking. But in French Revolution, in context of French Revolution in particular, Rousseau is often remembered. Now, Rousseau, interestingly, in fact, is one thinker who wrote a book on inequality, discourse on inequality. And why it is so significant? Because as we saw in the very beginning when I mentioned that there are three different vantage points through which freedom has been understood. One, absence of restraint. Number two, the choice. And number three, basically the conditions to actualize that choice. And Rousseau, unlike Hobbes and Locke who preceded them, basically has been considered an important thinker for the third one. That how the conditions should be congenial for realizing the choice. Simply by giving the choice is not freedom, or simply removing the hindrances or obstructions or impediments from your life is not freedom, which Hobbes did, or the choice aspect which Locke did. In fact, Rousseau broke from both of them and argued that simply impediments and choices, removal of impediments and presence of choices, cannot ensure freedom. But freedom you need that how human beings can realize the choices which are available, and therefore the conditions aspect, the conditions of society, he made mention of, and here the kind of reflection he made on inequality. the two types of inequality, natural inequality and the social inequality. And he argued that the natural inequality is something nothing can be done, and because by nature someone is tall, someone is short, someone is bald, someone has hair on the head, or different types of natural way in which people are unequal in society. So nothing can be done so far as natural inequality is concerned. But social inequality is a society created and socially made. So therefore it is to be taken care of, and it can be taken care of through human intervention. And that was his perhaps the biggest contribution, which later on was picked up by a whole host of socialist thinkers and was built differently, because the solution of this inequality Rousseau saw in general will, the resolution in general will, which perhaps the socialists and the Marxists didn't agree, because they believed that the kind of diagnosis which Rousseau made was correct, but the kind of treatment which he offered was not the correct one, because the kind of inequality that happens in society, which Rousseau was the first thinker to recognize, was largely on account of the capitalism on capitalist economy and political economy in society. So therefore that inequality required a different type of treatment. This is what the socialists and the Marxists basically argue. But nonetheless, Rousseau is considered to be a significant and most important thinker in modern time who recognized this aspect, and therefore highlighted this in his thought and his ideas, particularly the book called Discourse on Inequality.